All right, let's say our Al Svirata Omer blessing. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Svirat HaOmer. Yesterday was the 18th day of the Omer. So Hayom Tisha Asar Yom Shehem Shnei Shavuot V'chamisha Yamim LaOmer. Today is the 19th day of the Omer, which makes 2 weeks and 5 days to the Omer. Now we're going to say our La'asok B'divrei Torah blessing for studying Torah. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, our topic this evening is Shivat Zion, which is the return to Zion. And we're going to be looking at the return to Zion in our prayers. This is not to say that other people do not also have a connection to the land of Israel. This class is merely going to focus on the Jewish connection as expressed through prayers. But would you read our on one foot description, please?
The liturgical return to Zion on 1 foot. Ever since the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE, Jews have been yearning to return to the land of Israel. This yearning has been expressed in Jewish liturgy in a number of places.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with something not from Jewish liturgy, but it will help us to get into this. Jim, would you read Natan Sharansky's speech before sentencing from 1978, please?
From the start of my investigation, the heads of the KGB told me often that given my position with regard to this case, I would receive either capital punishment or, at best, 15 years of imprisonment. They promised that if I changed my mind and cooperated with them in their struggle against Jewish activists and dissidents, I would receive a short, symbolic sentence and the opportunity to join my wife in Israel. But I did not change my position either during the investigation or at the trial, and yesterday the prosecution demanded that I be sentenced to a term of 15 years. 5 years ago, I applied for an exit visa to emigrate from USSR to Israel. Today, I am further than ever from my goal. This would seem to be a cause for regret, but that is not the case. These 5 years were the best of my life. I am happy that I've been able to live them honestly and at peace with my conscience. I've said only what I believe, and I have not violated my conscience even when my life was in danger. I'm also happy that I've been able to help many people who needed help and who turned to me. I am proud that I came to know and work with such people as Andrei Sakharov, Yuri Orlov, and Alexander Ginsburg, who are carrying on the best traditions of the Russian intelligentsia. But most of all, I feel part of a marvelous historical process, the process of the national revival of Soviet Jewry and its return to the homeland, to Israel. I hope that the false and absurd but terribly serious charges made today against me, the entire Jewish people, will not impede the process of the national revival of the Jews of Russia, as the KGB has assured me they would, but will actually provide a new impulse, as has often happened in our history. Should I go on?
Yes, please. We're
Okay.
almost done. Thank you.
My relatives and friends know how strong my desire to join my wife in Israel, and with what joy at any moment I would have exchanged my so-called fame as a Jewish activist, for which the charge asserts I was striving for a visa to Israel. For 2,000 years, Jewish people, my people, have been dispersed all over the world and seemingly deprived of any hope of returning. But still, each year Jews have stubbornly and apparently without reason said to each other, Lashana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And today, when I am further than ever from my dream, from my people, and from Abatal, and when difficult years of prisons and camps lie ahead of me, I say to my wife and to my people, Lashana Haba'ah Yerushalayim. And to the court, which has only to read a sentence that was prepared long ago, to you I have nothing to say.
All right. Thank you. That was a lot. Do you mind reading the context as well?
Okay, context. Nathan Sharansky was a Russian Jew who lived when the Soviet Union was letting Jews emigrate to Israel. He was finally released after 13 years of pressure in February 1986. This speech was often repeated at Passover Seder's while he was in prison. What do you know or remember about the movement to free the Soviet Jews?
All right. Thank you.
I remember distinctly Shafam coming up with a song that became their hallmark, We Are Leaving Mother Russia. And I just remember seeing that with a group of room full of people who were crying because they had many Russian Jews at that time in Boston. So I remember that song about this time.
And the way that song ends, the very last line, so stand up and raise your voices to the sky, and the entire audience stands up. I saw them in person, and David hadn't been thought of yet, but my 80s version.
How about you muted yourself?
My 80s version of Revolting was trying to help the Soviet Jews get out of Russia and trying to help the women get into the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I just happen to remember at about that time seeing a lot of signs around in the neighborhood that I lived in Chicago about saying free the Soviet Jews.
Well, there were massive demonstrations as well. That was had political pressure. And why clearly that was a great resource that the Soviet Union did not want to lose. I mean, why else would you want to keep people there? But I know there were some cousins of mine, they wound up in Israel. My father had contact with them, but they were communicating through translators from Russian to Yiddish or something with friends my father knew, and I lost contact. But then I did find another cousin who got out in the 70s. He just popped up through because we both happened. He decided to do a DNA test on Ancestry, looking for family, and we found each other just about 2 years ago. So who knows? I mean, he said they wanted to get out, and they finally did. He said 1970. I'm sure all of us have some connection with somebody we know or some distant family member at least.
Do other people have memories of this time or know anything?
But I just wanted to add, if there's nobody else, well, I don't want to monopolize it, but this man and his family are very fiercely loyal and staunch supporters of Israel. Part of the family is there in military service, and he's in New Orleans, but he's happy to be a U.S. citizen, but very strongly supports and identifies with Israel. It's just to reinforce what we're hearing for Sharansky.
Sometime around the later 80s, the synagogue, I imagine many in the area, but they sponsored families that were coming, that were allowed to get out and not go to Israel, but came here.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember taking, getting the name of a family and taking food and some household goods and things up to the apartment they'd been given in Rogers Park.
Mm.
I took my two little ones with me at the time and spent a little time with them. We really couldn't communicate very well, but we communicated through hugs and a lot of nodding. And so I stayed in touch with them for a while. He was an engineer, and he called one evening and said he'd been able to find a job, and we stayed in touch for a while, and then I lost track of them. But that was an emotional moment. I remember being able to help a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I remember about 20 some odd years ago. I can't believe it's that long, but it 15, 20, well, yeah, I would say closer to 20 years or thereabouts. I remember my wife and I took a long weekend. There's some Hilton Hotel up northwestern suburbs or something, way up out, and they were having some sort of a weekend retreat. And most of these for youngsters, young people, and most of them were Russian Jews, and they were trying to help give them some religious orientation. So those things were happening at that time. I said 10, 20. So that would be in the late 90s, early 2000. Yeah, about that, early 2000s. So very.
I'd like to share a thought that Charles stimulated. Thank you, Charles. That I don't recall knowing any member of family or friends that were still in the Soviet Union at that time. My family had fled much earlier, closer to the time of Fiddler, or somewhere in that neighborhood, basically in the early 1900s, in the zeros, first 10 years of the 1900s. And my actual line came here late in that decade, around 07, 08, and 09, to the States, and here to Chicago as a destination on both sides. My mom and dad's sides. My mom and dad both being born here as babies of their families. And the thought that was stimulated is that Charles observed the logical deduction, whether it's true or not, that we had value to the Soviet Union at that time. Why else would they want to keep us? Was his rhetorical question. And I thought, how ironic, and I was thinking this at the time too, how ironic that at the time of Fiddler, and at the time my grandparents were looking to flee with their families, that they didn't have any use for us, and they were showing us the door in the form of pogroms and encouraging us to get the heck out. And decades later, they wouldn't let us out. How times change sometimes. The discrimination never changes, but the times and the way that it's expressed.
Yeah.
All right, let's go on. Herb, would you read Hatikva in English, please?
As long as in the heart within a Jewish soul still yearns, and onward towards the ends of the east, and I still yearns towards Zion. Our hope is not yet lost, the hope of 2,000 years to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem.
Thank you. And we've got some context.
Hatikva was written in 1878 by Naftali Hertz Imber in Zolochev, then part of the Austrian Poland, now in Ukraine. He brought it with him when he made Aliyah in 1882, and the pioneers of Rishon LeZion were quite taken with it. Shmuel Cohen heard it and set it to a Romanian folk melody in 1887. That folk melody can also be heard in Bedřich Smetana's Moldau, sometimes called Vltava, about a minute into the piece. The poem was sung at the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901 and all subsequent ones, including in 1903, by those opposed to the Uganda plan for a Jewish home in modern Kenya. Finally, in 1933, it was adopted as the official anthem of the Zionist movement. From 1948 to 2004, it was the unofficial national anthem of the State of Israel, and in 2004, it became the official national anthem. Note that the line, Olo Avdad Tikvatenu, our hope is not yet lost, is probably an allusion to Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones, the Haftorah for Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. When the dry bones say, Avdad Tikvatenu, our hope is lost, in Ezekiel 37:11. How has liturgy played a role in maintaining the hope of 2,000 years?
Thank you.
Well, there's a great deal in the Amida about the history of Jews and everything from the sacrifices to the way we were treated. And there are a lot of people who like to skip those sections of the Amida. They don't want to, for some reason, try and recall all of that.
Think that the liturgy has contributed to this a lot, especially by preserving not merely the hope of 2,000 years, but the way of more than 2,000 years, preserving all of Jewish practice, Jewish life, Jewish observance from thousands of years before the exile and periods in between. So in this long chain going down all the way to us today. And so I think that the liturgy's role is the same role really that, for example, Jewish law has in preserving the hope of 2,000 years by maintaining the entire tradition, really, in a form that has survived from antiquity. There were lots of other cultures that didn't really survive antiquity. But this has been one of the ways that we have. So that's sort of my thought on where the role of the liturgy, what the role of the liturgy is in maintaining this hope by continuing our connection to the land and to the region.
Thank you. Others?
If I may. Thank you, gentlemen and lady. I'm reminded that every day when I say Amida, the couple of tefillim, tefillot that Bnei Yerushalayim and the David, our Skyan, and flourishing refers to me positively to Eretz Israel and the holiness of the land and our history. And also the flip side of our plea is what started off as non-obligatory and is often skipped on days, like the whole month of Nisan and various other times during the year, which I hope I have made it clear that I'm talking about Tachanun. It's an amazing, amazing set of tefillot and statements that beseech God for forgiveness and for fatherly loving and reminding us of the promises and the covenant between the pieces and all this stuff that goes into the Tachanun, long and short. And it's in my face every day. And it took me till this class and hearing you guys inspire me to remember that it's every day, except the days we don't say it, but still it's in my heart every day. That I'm always part of that voice whenever I say Tachanun. And and it's part of my heart too. I'm good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so at this point, we're going to shift into me talking for the next 28-ish minutes or so. Just so you know what's coming up.
Before you do, may I make one remark? Thank you. I just want to say that in the liturgy, correct me if this is wrong, you think, very much we say, I think it's in the festival Amidas and so on, on account of our sins, we were exiled, and we look to, and so we were scattered, and we look to God to make it so that we come back to the land and assemble the dispersed and bring together the outcast, and that has been the spirit of the diaspora Jewish liturgy, I think, and of the Jews for a very long time, well into the middle of the 20th century. The idea that you could take it into your own hands to change that was certainly, I won't get into the politics, but certainly it was highly controversial, to say the very least. And it's striking what a radical shift it was, and it was not contemplated when the Zionist Congress was meeting, which was mostly, I think, socialists and atheists, and that they were seeking to sacralize it. And I just want to make that point. And
yes,
shut up.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, the prayers that we're going to look to were all with the idea that it was going to be up to God to bring about a return, because for most of the time when Jews were saying these prayers, they did not have the ability to come back in any meaningful numbers. Certain times we get more immigration to the land of Israel, for instance, in the 1500s with the Kabbalists who gather in Tzfat. But there was no possibility that we could reestablish our own country in Israel. When I staffed an 8th grade trip to Israel through the Federation a couple of weeks ago, one of the points that one of the organizers made was that these 8th graders were living what their great-grandparents could only dream about. This idea that you could get into a tin can in the sky, a big bird, fly across the ocean, end up in Israel in a mere 11 hours, 13 hours the other way, and walk the land that they read about in the Torah was something that you hoped for, but didn't imagine you would actually ever be able to do. And so this idea that the 8th graders should realize how lucky they are to be living in a time when they can do this gets to the point that Phil was making, that it was always assumed that God was going to have to make this happen. And presumably, it was only going to happen when the Messiah came. So many people saw God's hand in this when the state of Israel was declared. And then there were those who felt that trying to do this without the Messiah having come was somewhere between a very bad idea and blasphemous, and they were opposed to it. In the last 75 years, as Israel turns 75 tomorrow night, there's been a major change in most of the movements of Judaism regarding their attitude toward the political state of Israel, starting with the conservative movement being Zionist either from the beginning or very close to the beginning, while the Reform movement, as they were changing words in the prayer book, took out all reference to returning to Israel. So pretty much everything we're going to look at, for the most part, was taken out of the early Reform prayer books, lest there be any thought that Jews weren't happy where they were living. And slowly over time, it's been returned to the Reform prayer book as either an option or just this is part of the prayer eventually for some of these things. And in the Orthodox world, there's been a shift as well in attitudes towards the state of Israel. So with that, let's get into the texts. So these prayers come in a couple of different buckets. The clearest one are the prayers that call for the ingathering of the exiles. The ones that say explicitly, God, please bring us back to the land of Israel. We start with the Haggadah when we say next year in Jerusalem. If you are in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder, then you say next year in a rebuilt Jerusalem, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habnuya, that Jerusalem be built up physically, that it be built up spiritually, in all sorts of ways that it can be improved. I thought of this when I was in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago, and I saw all the construction equipment, and the tour guide commented that people like to joke that the national bird of Israel is the construction crane. So we also have Ahava Rabbah. This is the prayer before the Shema in the morning, both on weekday and Shabbat. And we have Havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz. Bring us in peace from the four corners of the earth and lead us upright to your land. This prayer is often sung to Hatikva. And this is when we bring our tzitzit together to symbolize coming together. In the blessing for the new month, when the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh, before the new month, when we announce the new month, we say, may God who wrought miracles for our ancestors, redeeming them from slavery to freedom, redeem us soon and gather our dispersed from the four corners of the earth. And that's just before we announce the month and when it's going to be. In the weekday Amidah, of the 19 blessings, one of them is about this very topic. Tekabah shofar, sound the great shofar for liberty, and raise a banner to gather our exiles and gather us together from the four corners of the earth. Praise to you, Adonai, gather the dispersed of God's people, Israel. That's blessing 10 of 19. In the festival Amidah in Musaf, we have V'karev Pizurenu, welcome back our dispersed among the nations and gather those that are scattered to the very ends of the earth. We also have references to Jerusalem, bring us in joyful chorus to Zion, your city, to Jerusalem, home of your sanctuary, with everlasting joy. This is, the second half is also often sung to Hatikva. V'karev Pizurenu has its own tune that's often done. V'karev Pizurenu, and so on. In the regular Shabbat Amidah for Musaf, we have, after Tikanta Shabbat, in the middle of that paragraph, may it be your will, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors, who restores their descendants to their land, to lead us there in joy and to plant us in our borders. Going back to the Haggadah, in Magid, we have Halach Ma'anya, which mostly gets talked about with the first part. This is the bread of poverty. However, referring to the matzah, however, there is that line, Hashta hacha l'shana haba'a be'arad Yisrael. This is Aramaic for, now we are here, next year we will be in the land of Israel. So we start the Seder with this idea, we end the Seder with this idea. At the end of the Seder, right before Rosh Hashanah Haba B'Yerushalayim, we have Chasal Siddur Pesach, which ends with bring it close with the plantings of the saplings redeemed to Zion in joy. And this paragraph can be sung to Hatikva as well. In Birkat Hamazon, in the blessing after we eat, the long version has a set of harachamans, which say, may the all-merciful do this and that and the other. And one of those is Harachaman hu shpor u'enimei al savarenu v'hu yolichenu kumi u'ertzenu. May you, the all-merciful, break the yoke from our neck and lead us upright to our land. Similarly, Psalm 126, Shir HaMalot, at the beginning of Birkat Hamazon, on Shabbat and festivals, Shuva Adonai et Shivitenu ka'afikim b'negev, bring us back from our captivity, O Lord, like watercourses in the Negev. So although this was originally composed in Babylonia during the first exile, there's this idea that we are still in Galut, we're still in exile, we're outside of the land of Israel, and we want God to bring us back. And that is why we continue to sing this, even though we were brought back from Babylonian captivity. In Psuke de Zimra, Psalm 147 has the line, the Lord rebuilds Jerusalem, God gathers in the exiles of Israel. It's not sung out loud, so it's easy to miss that part.
Wow.
In the Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, Musaf, we have another reference to the same thing from what we saw in Shabbat Musaf, about God who restores the descendants to their land, lead us there in joy, plant us in within our borders where our ancestors once offered to their sacrifices. So a lot of references all over the place explicitly to returning, to being brought back to Israel. The rest of the buckets have to do with not explicitly bring us back to Jerusalem, or bring us back to Israel, but other things related to that. So for instance, we have a bucket of prayers that call for the restoring of worship to Jerusalem, presumably by Jews. At the end of every Amidah, we have the Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu paragraph, which has the line, restore the service to the Holy of Holies in your abode, and the fire offerings of Israel, and accept their prayer lovingly and willingly. And may our eyes behold your merciful return to Zion. So this idea that we want to return to worshiping God in Jerusalem in the Holy of Holies. We have in the Shabbat festival, Amidah, rebuild your temple as of old, make us joyful in restoration. There we will go up appearing before you, paying homage and pilgrimage 3 times a year. We have in the Shabbat Kedusha, Shabbat Shachri Kedusha, we have, when shall you rule in Zion, Matai Timloch B'Tzion, but be soon in our day and throughout all time, may you be exalted and sanctified in Jerusalem, your city from one generation to another forever and ever.
Amen.
We have when we take the Torah around. Romamu Adonai Eloheinu, exalt Adonai and bow down at God's holy mountain, for Adonai our God is holy. God's holy mountain being the Temple Mount. This is also from one of the Psalms in Psuke de Zimra. In Hallel, to you will I offer thanksgiving offering, and I will call out the name of the Lord in the courtyards of the house of the Lord in your midst, Jerusalem. The psalm that we say in the month of Elul through Hoshana Rabbah. One thing I ask of the Lord, only that do I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to frequent God's temple. This is a desire to go back to Jerusalem. In weekday Mariv, we have before the Amidah, blessed is Adonai from Zion who dwells in Jerusalem, praise God. May our eyes behold, our heart rejoice, our soul exalt in your true deliverance when it will be said in Zion, your God has begun the divine reign. So we have that. Then we have a bucket of prayers that mention rebuilding Jerusalem. So a desire to return to Jerusalem. In the Torah service for Shabbat and festivals, Tivneh Chomot Yerushalayim, build the walls of Jerusalem. I will tell you that I studied at Hebrew University for a semester in college, and I had the opportunity to do a Shabbaton at Hebrew Union College outside of the old city of Jerusalem. And we were doing the Torah service outside, and we sang, Tivneh Chomot Yerushalayim, build the walls of Jerusalem. And I was looking at the walls of Jerusalem, and that was super powerful. And on this trip to Israel, I was walking on the walls of Jerusalem, because you can walk on the old city walls, the Rampart Walk it's called. So the walls of Jerusalem, we have this desire to build the walls of Jerusalem, to rebuild the city, to make it better than it is now. We have in Birkat Hamazon, Uvnei Yerushalayim, and rebuild Jerusalem, the holy city, speedily in our days. Praise to you, Lord, who in your compassion rebuilds Jerusalem. Amen. Incidentally, this is the only time that we say Amen to our own blessing. And it's there because this used to be the end of Birkat Hamazon. And then more stuff got added afterwards. This has nothing to do with food. Birkat Hamazon is what we say after we eat. And the rabbis put this paragraph here, not because it has something to do with food, but because this was after the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem by the Romans, and the rabbis wanted to make sure that the Jews remembered Jerusalem. And so they figured that if the Jews had to talk about Jerusalem 3 times a day, plus after snacks, they would probably remember it, which seems to have worked. We have the weekday Amidah. Another paragraph is all about returning and rebuilding Jerusalem. We have Birkat Hamazon, the Shabbat paragraph, a mention of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, your holy city. We've Yan Yerushalayim Er Kodshecha. We have Simchat Torah, Atah Harei Toledad, the call and response lines that are said before we start the Hakafot. And towards the end of that, we have rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in there. So that we've got all these. Then we've got a bucket of prayers that just mention Jerusalem. And I'm going to posit that by having Jerusalem continually mentioned in our liturgy, this serves the purpose of keeping the Jews aware of Jerusalem and aware of the land of Israel and not forgetting it, so that there's more of a desire to return to it because it's still in their memory. So we start with the Shabbat evening service, Hashkivenu, which is about lying down in peace. And at the end, one of the differences between the Shabbat version and the weekday version is that we say, praise to you, Lord, who spreads the shelter of peace over us and over Jerusalem. In Birkat Hamazon, we have, and the Amidah, we have on the new moon and on holidays, we have the Ya'aleh V'Yavo paragraph, which contains a part about remembering, asking God to remember Jerusalem, your holy city. Incidentally, by reminding God of Jerusalem, we are also reminding ourselves of Jerusalem. We have the Haftorah blessings, a paragraph about, and the blessing after, about asking God to have compassion on Zion, Rachem al Zion, and causing Zion to rejoice with her children. Mesamech Zion bebaneha. Friday night, we have Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi is 9 paragraphs, or 9 verses.
Yeah.
The first one is about Shabbat, which makes sense. We're doing this on Shabbat. The second one is about Shabbat. Numbers 3 through 8 are about Jerusalem. And then we go back to Shabbat at the end. So there's this idea that we are welcoming Shabbat, we are welcoming in a better time, and part of a better time is when Jerusalem is restored to being full of life with the Jewish people who used to live there coming back to it. A lot of the phrases in Lecha Dodi come from Isaiah and are in the Haftorahs of Consolation in the summer. In Birkat Mazon, we have the Rachem paragraph where we ask God to have mercy not only upon the Jewish people, but upon Jerusalem. V'al Yerushalayim Irecha, V'al Tzion, and on Zion. Hoshanot. Hoshanot are the walking arounds that we do on Sukkot, and especially on Hoshana Rabbah, holding the lulav and etrog, except on Shabbat when we just walk around without them. And one of the things that we say during the Hoshanot is all about references to Jerusalem, as is given away by the phrase, excellent Zion, Zion Hamtsugenet. Then we have the Psalm for Monday. Every day in the temple, the priests would sing a different psalm depending on what day of the week it was. So, for instance, on Shabbat, they would sing Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, and on Friday, they'd sing Psalm 93, both of which made it into the Friday night service. The Psalm for Monday, not as well known unless you go to weekday morning services. However, at the end, it has the line, walk around Zion, circle it, count its towers, take note of its ramparts, go through its citadels. All of which you can do today. And by saying this once a week, we're remembering Zion. These psalms were the ones that were sung by the Levim, by the priests. All right, then we have a bucket of prayers that mention Israel as our inheritance. So, starting with the second paragraph of the Shema, this paragraph mostly talks about reward and punishment. It comes from Deuteronomy, it's the Hayayim Shema paragraph. And it says that if you do things like teach about Judaism to your children and to other generations, if you speak of them and think about them when you're at home and away from home, when you're rising up, when you're lying down, you have tefillin, if you have mezuzah, same things that are in the V'ahavta but in a different order, then your days will be prolonged and the days of your children upon the land which the Lord swore to your ancestors to give them for as long as the heavens are above the earth. We also have something from Chronicles, which is in the Psukei de Zimra warm-up section of the service. Be ever mindful of God's covenant, the promise God gave for 1,000 generations, that God made with Abraham, swore to Isaac, and confirmed in a decree for Jacob, for Israel as an eternal covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your allotted heritage. So that's fairly early in the service. Then we have a very small bucket of prayers that mention Israel. So in this bucket, what I was able to find was the prayer for the community. After the Haftorah, but before the Torah is returned to the Ark, we have a set of prayers. We have a prayer for our country, a prayer for peace, prayer for the community. And so in there, this is usually where the Shaliach Tzibor, where the prayer leader starts chanting, we've got V'chol Misho Skim B'tzorchei Tzibor U'Vibyanya Eretz Yisrael Be'emunah, which means, God, please bless the congregation and everybody who does all sorts of things to take care of the community, and including all those who faithfully devote themselves to the need of this community and to the land of Israel. So it's mentioned in there. Finally, we have a bucket with prayers for the modern state of Israel. These are of a much more recent authorship. We start with one in Birkat Mazon. So you've got the main set of Harachmans, the one saying, may the All-Merciful do this and do that and do the other. Then you've got another paragraph of Bamarom. Then you've got more Harachmans. For the All-Merciful, do this, and these are mostly situation specific. So this is where you've got the one for Shabbat and the one for holidays. And that section ends with one about Messiah. Before the one for the Messiah, there's one that says, Harachaman Yivarechet Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Smichat Geulateinu. May the All-Merciful bless the state of Israel at the beginning of the flowering of redemption. So something that we say after we eat. And then we have the prayer for the state of Israel, which I believe was written by Rabbi Cook, Rav Avram Cook. So there are different tunes for this. There's Avinu Shabashamayim Sor Yisrael V'Goalo V'Harecha Medinat Yisrael Reshit Smichat Geulateinu. There's also Avinu Shabashamayim Sor Yisrael V'Goalo, and it goes on from there. So these are two of the most common tunes for this. There are a variety of other ones as well. And this prayer, there's a shorter version, there's a longer version that keeps going past where the shorter version ends. The source sheet has the longer version. And it's a set of desires for the modern state of Israel. Bringing good counsel to its leaders, bringing peace to the land and everlasting joy to its inhabitants, and so on. And then finally, I have put here an appendix of a history of next year in Jerusalem, that where somebody looked at this phrase and where it comes from and wrote it all out. So
That's it.
A lot here, a lot to think about. And hopefully as you're going through services, the next time that you're in services, you'll notice more the references to Israel and Jerusalem, and have it in your mind as well.